Hello and welcome to the Orion Incident Room. I'm Paul Burke and I write about books. I also host the Crime Time FM podcast, In Person with Paul. Our topic today is police procedural, and we have a fantastic panel of writers to discuss their work and the topic, and they're chomping at the bit to get going. So I'll keep the introductions short and I'll crack on. In ABC order, we have Matthew M.J. Arlidge, who's a novelist, screenwriter and producer, depending on which day of the week it is. He's worked on a number of top TV shows like EastEnders and Silent Witness, and his first novel, Eeny Meeny, came out in 2014. This was the first D.I. Helen Grace novel, and 9 bestsellers have followed since. His audiobook, 6 Degrees of Assassination, was a #1 bestseller. His latest novel, Truth or Dare, came out in June and gives a new meaning to the term office politics. It's already storming the bestseller charts. Simon Beckett is a journalist and multi-million selling crime writer. Simon's Dr. David Hunter Forensic Anthropologist series opened with The Chemistry of Death in 2006. It was sparked by a visit to America's National Forensic Academy in Tennessee, otherwise known as the Body Farm. He's written 5 standalones and has been shortlisted for the CWA Dagger. His new novel, The Lost, is the first in the D.S. Jonah Colley series and will be released in November. Daniel Cole is a former paramedic, RSPCA and RNLI officer, and is now a full-time writer. His debut novel, Ragdoll, released in 2014, was a Sunday Times bestseller. Over 500,000 copies sold to date, and Daniel's books sell in 35 countries. His new novel, Mimic, will be published in August, and I'll leave Daniel to explain why a bookshop in the Netherlands has an imitation statue of Rodin's The Thinker holding a copy of his book. So welcome, guys. How are you?
Not bad,
Good, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, I think the best way to start really is if we give people a flavour of the novel. So, Simon, would you like to start and tell us a little bit about The Lost, please?
Yeah, it's, as you explained, it's a departure from the series I've been writing about David Hunter. The main character is called Jonah Colley, who is a Metropolitan Police firearms officer. And he's called out one night. He receives a call from someone he's not met in many years. There's obviously a bit of history between them, to go and meet him late at night in an abandoned warehouse at a place called Slaughter Quay, which is in a very run-down Dockland area of London. Mm-hmm. He goes out there, and what he encounters basically changes his life from then on. I don't want to give too much away, but he's badly injured. And that really sets up a confrontation with his own past, really. As the novel progresses, he begins to wonder if there's a trauma in his own past, and he begins to realise that what's happening in the present might have something to do with an event in his own history from 10 years before.
Yeah, well, you're right. Of course, we don't want to give too much away. But one thing that did strike me about your novel was that Jonah actually winds up doing his own investigation, if you like. So there's sort of the police investigation and there's Jonah's investigation because he needs to clear himself.
Yeah.
If we move on then, Matthew, tell us about Truth or Dare and Helen Grace.
So Truth or Dare is the 10th Helen Grace book, and it's by far the most complicated one I've ever written. I wrote it during lockdown. I started in March last year, which turned out to have been a really bad time to start writing a book. So it was completed during lockdown when we were homeschooling, which basically meant that I tried to teach my kids maths sort of during the morning, and then in the afternoon I tried to write. But the howls of agony from my younger child meant that I couldn't write in the house. It was too noisy. So This is the first and hopefully last book that I wrote in the garden shed. But Truth or Dare basically it's set sort of slightly post-COVID in Southampton when the whole city appears to have gone mad. There's just a spree of random murders, none of them connected. And it's as if this sort of summer frenzy of murder has descended suddenly on Southampton. And it sort of falls to Helen Grace and her team to piece together the clues. And even when they do try, start to make some progress, things barely seem to make any sense because the perpetrators seemingly have no connection to their victims or indeed any motive for killing them. And obviously it falls to Helen to eventually work out the hidden connection between them and the sinister puppet master behind it all. But it's for me, I think it's the best one I've written, and it's the only one I've ever had to draw a massive diagram with lines pointing everywhere to remind me who's connected to who killed who, and why.
That's a fair point, because there are an awful lot of things going on in this book. I mean,
Yeah.
the phrase crime wave doesn't cover it.
No, indeed.
Yeah.
It's butchery.
Daniel, tell us about Mimic, please.
So in 1989, Detective Sergeant Benjamin Chambers is on the trail of a serial killer who is recreating the world's greatest works of art with the bodies of his victims. When the investigation almost cost Chambers his life, the case goes cold and the killer lies dormant. Fast forward 7 years and we join Jordan Marshall, who is a new recruit to the Metropolitan Police and who has a very personal connection to the case. She's obsessed and discovers new evidence, and she manages to convince Chambers and his partner to reopen the investigation. But by doing so, they spark a fresh spate of murders as their killer finally decides to try and finish his collection.
Yes, indeed, a devious serial killer. So there's
Yeah.
sort of another kind of genre creeping in there. Okay, let's start with something very straightforward. I hope some of the questions are a little bit more complex than this one, but who are your favorite police procedural writers? The influences or contemporaries, I don't mind which. Matthew, start, please.
Oh, that's a tricky one, really. I mean, I sort of, although the Helen Grace books are sort of procedural, I view them, I guess, probably more as thrillers, because for me, I do like procedure, but, you know, I think you have to enjoy it and then sort of slightly mess with it and throw it away if possible. So I think, you know, for me, my favorite writers are Thomas Harris, people like that who really sort of shake things up. And I think, you know, for me, I enjoy Clarice Starling, those sort of characters, but only once they're sort of slightly freed from the shackles of police procedure. You know, I've obviously written in the past, I've written Silent Witness and shows like that are entirely procedural. But I think, you know, for me, I sort of, you know, I enjoy the trappings of it. But for me, the ticking clock, the urgency of a thriller is what, for me, has to drive every police procedural.
Yeah, fair enough. So, Daniel, same sort of question, but then perhaps we should be more open about it. I did think about this. Perhaps we shouldn't say police procedural, but just say, you know, who are your favorites and what influences have you had?
Yeah, I did think when they invited me to the police procedural panel that they got the right guy, because I kind of play a bit fast and loose with the rules, really. I think some stories just, you can't tell in the realms of real life. You just can't get away with it. And I think, like with any genre, like, you know, I'm a bit of a sci-fi buff and things like that in the movies. And you just have to establish your set of ground rules from the beginning and stick to that. And I think that carries across to writing thrillers as well. You know, as long as you've got your ground rules, you know how far you can push things and when you're starting to edge over the boundary a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I've done a bit more reading up until my house moved the last couple of months. It's taken up every waking minute.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, recently, I mean, I've loved reading the last of the Joseph Knox books. They were brilliant and maybe more gritty and true to life than some of the things I tend to read and watch. I've really enjoyed them. But yeah, always the movies. I mean, Seven was always a film that they compared Ragdoll to when it first came out.
Mm-hmm.
And I did watch it again just a couple of weeks ago, and it's still just as good now as it always was.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Simon?
Pretty much the same, actually. I'm interested to hear that no one else really sees to see themselves as writing police procedurals, and neither do I. I think I view what I do as much more on the thriller end of the spectrum. And again, looking at Thomas Harris, fantastic. Seven on films, yeah, they're all sort of touch films. In terms of my own sort of like reading inclination, I think, and I'm due to reread them, but Raymond Chandler was my introduction to crime fiction. Really, I came in to it quite late. I'll be in my 20s, and I picked up The Big Sleep. And that was the first time I realised that crime fiction wasn't all sort of murders in the drawing rooms. I got a lot to learn, really. So it's that sort of thing, and the sort of, I suppose, the lone investigator, or is John D. MacDonald, people like that. It's that sort of draw for me rather than the strictly procedural elements.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, we might get onto that actually, the lone investigator thing, because the novels all tend to have. There's a little bit of that about all of them, I think, in a sense. But okay, as we're saying that now, then your novels are police procedural in the sense that they've got police officers in them and they do follow certain procedures. So we'll stick with that for the moment. But how would you describe your books then? I mean, let's start. I don't know, Matt, you start, please.
Well, I think when I first wrote them, I was a bit of a crime dullard. I was not sort of fully aware of the canon, and I've sort of been reading around ever since and realized that the books that I write are probably more American than sort of classically British, in the sense that I think they're closer to Harlan Coben or the early James Patterson. I loved it when I first started reading the Alex Cross books, because my chapters are always like 2 or 3 pages long, which I was always a bit embarrassed about. I thought maybe they should be longer, but I like to keep them short. And then I read the early Alex Cross books, and he had chapters that were 1 page long, and I thought, that's brilliant. This is more my kind of thing. And I think what that does is it creates a sort of narrative momentum, a narrative speed, basically. And if you've got multi-POVs like I have, it just creates this sort of breakneck speed. And I think that's always been my ambition, really, for the books, is that I want them to have interesting characters, complex narratives, good baddies, and a good sort of ending. But crucially, I just want them to have this amazing narrative momentum, so that, to try and create the unputdownable book, and generally, I would say that people generally read my book in sort of 1 or 2 sittings. And that's for me, the thing is to keep the hook, keep them on the line, as it were, and just never let them go. And so I think, in that sense, they are kind of pure sort of breakneck thrillers, because I just love, I like that sort of book. I like that sort of film, that sort of narrative momentum that just, propels you forward. And, 7, even though it has its sort of longeurs and moments of deep character, nevertheless, with a sort of gruesome body count and a sort of inventive, flamboyant way of death, from start to finish, you never lose interest, do you? And I think that's what I sort of love, is just those breakneck thrillers.
So Southampton's not really like that then?
Well, Saturday night it is, but every other day. But Southampton's lovely because, it's a port city. So all sorts of nastiness comes in and out of ports. Plus, you're just on the edge of the New Forest where Daniel now lives, which is all full of, that's an ancient woodland that's riven with historical bloodshed and all sorts of stuff. So it's a great setting, as Daniel will soon discover.
Right. So, Simon, as we've now decided we're all propulsive thriller writers and not actually police procedurals, I better not ask about whether I thought David Hunter's novels were actually procedurals. But how would you describe your novels then?
I think they're quite character-driven, particularly the David Hunter ones, which are first person, so we see everything through his eyes. The new one, the Jonah Colley one, The Lost, that's third person. That is faster paced. But I think what they have got in common is the sense of place and atmosphere is very important, I think, for me. I like to get a sort of an immersive sense. So when anybody's reading it, they can feel themselves being in these locations, which are generally pretty nasty and often gloomy old buildings, that sort of thing. So I do also like to, as indeed we all do, we're all thriller writers, it's the twists are important, and they have to be sort of planted so when they actually happen, they come as a surprise, but the groundwork's been laid beforehand. So I think most of my books start off looking as though there's one thing going off, but then by the end of it, you realise that it's a different sort of story entirely. So I don't really know what I'd call them, but that's about it.
No, well, it particularly is a lone wolf book. How about you, Daniel?
I think, when I first started trying to write, I really wanted to write TV shows or movies. I'd never thought about writing a proper book at all. And in fact, Ragdoll was a TV show. It was a pilot that I wrote, a 1-hour pilot that got rejected by everyone.
Right.
And I didn't want to let it go. So I sat down on my computer. I had my Ragdoll screenplay on my left-hand side, Harry Potter 6 on my right-hand side, and decided I had to mash them together to try and make a book out of it. And fortunately, it worked out. So I think really what I try and achieve with my books is I want it to be a movie. I want it to read like a movie and play out in people's heads like that. And in fact, in Mimic, there's certain points where it's almost like a camera direction I've given.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've got this shot in my mind of what would happen if this was on screen. So this big aerial shot of what's happening. And it's basically just a paragraph that's just a camera direction. But I think it works in the context of the book. But I mean, it's funny, you see some of the foreign like front covers to the books, and they go quite gruesome with it, which always takes me by surprise. Like I think, oh, is that for my book? And people think I'm mad because
really?
Because well, on paper, you know, mine sound pretty horrific, but I think when you read them, you know, there's so much warmth from the characters and humor sort of injected in there as well. That I don't think of them that way. But I think, yeah, overall, I just want them to be entertaining more than anything.
Yeah. So you think people kind of come to you more maybe because they're looking for the kind of Thomas Harris read rather than the police procedural, if you like.
Well, definitely not for the police procedural, no.
We're going to have to talk about it a little bit, though. I think, well, every one of you has written a book that's got a detective in it. And there's always this issue. I asked a few people beforehand, actually, about questions, you know, because I know we're not live, but just to give a few people a chance to say. And Nick Quantrill came up with this question. He said, how do you create an original detective? And there is always this idea that the detective is the cliche, booze-soaked, womanizing divorcee who's a maverick. I'm assuming everybody actually likes the concept of a maverick. But how do you actually have to worry about it in the sense that you don't want to be like something else, or is it just an imaginative process and you just come up with your characters? Daniel, start that one, please.
I think I think when I first start a book, then there may be more sort of two-dimensional sort of characters. But as soon as you've started putting in you know, the plot twists and the beats of the story, you start going through it with these characters and they start taking their own shape. So quite often I'll sort of start off and I'll have quite a dull two-dimensional character. Write the first sort of 6 chapters. By the time that's happened, something pretty horrible's probably happened, and then I'll go back and start sort of go and fix it with the fleshed out character. And I suppose I do that all the way through the book, and I'm sure other people do as well. I think it's interesting to sort of play and to riff on these sort of cliches, and definitely like I've done that. I've sort of taken all those sort of standard things, you know, divorced and alcohol problems and things, but then try and play on them in a way that's you know, not been done before, or a little bit original. Rather than try and avoid them altogether.
Yeah, right. Matt?
You know, I'd agree with that, because I think there's a certain sort of element which is, you know, a sort of given in a way that you inevitably probably your main character will be a bit of a maverick and a lone wolf, because if they did everything by the book and everything sort of procedurally accurately, then they would be Gareth Southgate, which is great, but it's not necessarily who you want as your main character. And I think that,
although we are hoping it might be.
Yeah, well, who knows? Yeah, but even then, it'll be a quiet and understated victory, which is great. but you know, it's sort of not what everyone wants. So I think there are certain things like that you have to embrace, because unless it's a genuine sort of team book, but I think that's pretty rare, really, because you tend to sort of focus on your main character, don't you? And then, I mean, I think it's pretty much impossible to do an original character. I think you can just try and avoid some of the obvious pitfalls. You know, so Helen doesn't drink at all, and she's allergic to relationships, and she's female as well. So you've avoided 3 big cliches there straight away. But even she is definitely imbued by the ghosts of others. You know, very much there's a little bit of Thomas Harrison, and there's quite a large amount of Stieg Larsson in there, because I think when I was creating her, Lisbeth Salander was very much in my head, and I think Helen is sort of like older sister of Lisbeth, you know. So I think it's basically phenomenally hard, but you can avoid some of the obvious pitfalls and hopefully imbue enough of yourself in the character that it does have a little sort of unique quality about him.
Yeah, right. Simon, tell us about Jonah then, please.
Well, Jonah is, although on paper, again, he looks like a hard case, and he could look after himself. Again, I didn't. It's a matter of playing with the sort of expectations and of the genre, because I did want him to have vulnerabilities and flaws. So I think it's the same sort of thing. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to create an entirely new character, a unique one. So I think it becomes a case of then trying to just play around with expectations a little bit.
Right.
And trying to get in, and for me, it's very much a case of just trying to get into the character's head, get a backstory going for them. Characters are always going to develop as you're writing the story anyway, and you become more accustomed to them. But it's sort of just trying to step into their shoes and think, okay, well, what would this sort of person do in this sort of situation? And just trying to visualize and feel your way through it, and let them grow and develop as a character rather than trying to force anything on them. Which can be difficult sometimes, because if the plot would be a lot easier if a certain thing had happened and the character isn't the sort of person who will go along with that, then you've got to rethink it rather than just trying to force them to go along with the plot. So just let them develop and just try and put yourself into their situation.
Yeah, because readers are very savvy to those things these days.
Yeah.
Just wondering then, even though we're not police procedural writers, how much is that model of sort of the murder or the disappearance followed by the suspects, clues, red herrings, investigation, resolution? I mean, how much do you work to that kind of pattern, Matt?
Well,
it's the sort of old model, isn't it, for the old?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know. You just play with each. I mean, the genius. I mean, I wrote for Silent Witness, and that is pure procedure.
Right.
And I would say very different to the books I write, but interesting in this context because, a tiny little clue, sort of A leads to B because so and so, had something on the sole of their shoe, which leads to C, and eventually, after 2 hours of Silent Witness, you get to Z and the reveal. And you couldn't have got to there had you not had A, B, C, D. And they're all tiny little incremental procedure. And it's absolutely brilliant, but it is painstakingly detailed and procedural and requires an awful lot of work, and actually, there obviously is a different way to go, which is the sort of more thriller, so which has sort of rather bigger leaps and bigger twists and all the rest of it. But I don't particularly favor one or the other because I just think they're both. A really good procedural writer is absolutely brilliant, but you have to, that requires oodles of research and you have to have sort of, blood under your fingernails really to make that work. But on Silent Witness, I always found it really hard, and I kept trying to turn Silent Witness into a thriller basically because I much more enjoyed that than having to do the really hard procedural work. And then in terms of the other stuff, I think, listen, you just try and shake it up each time, don't you? And so one time there'll be a nobody murder, which is always fun, or you can do your traditional, or this one, for instance, the one I've done, because normally in my books it is one serial killer hunting down various, and it's just one perpetrator doing this. This one, I've got multiple perpetrators, and it's more a question of why it's happening rather than anything else. And I think all you can do if you're writing, especially if you're writing a series, I used to write 2 Helen Grace books a year. Now I'm doing 1, but even so, doing 1 every year, you have to think quite carefully about how not to bore your reader, basically, because they love the characters, but they don't want the same book just with different names each time. So each time you have to think quite carefully, I think, about the pattern of the killing, anything just to sort of keep them refreshed, as well as enjoying all the familiar elements, which of course are the joy of a series, your characters, your setting and so forth. So yeah, you just have to keep refreshing it, I think.
Yeah, would you agree with that, Simon?
Yeah, I would. When I sit down to write a book, I don't think I've ever approached any 2 novels in the same way.
Right.
Sometimes I've had, a later scene in mind, or a particular character who I think, okay, that would make a good killer, good villain. At times, which is the case of the new one, The Lost, it was the opening scene, opening chapter that sort of struck me. So I don't really sort of sit down and have the sort of any sort of procedural template in mind, thinking, you've got to A, B, C, and all the rest of it. It's a case of just getting these situations and characters and then just trying to tell a story as well as you can. That's as compelling as you can, because what you need to do is to keep the reader's interest. And as Matt says, you can't keep repeating yourself. So each time you're writing, you've got to try and make it a little bit different, keeping the same features that people have hopefully enjoyed in your previous books, but giving it that new tweak and a new twist, so you don't end up, doesn't get repetitive. But I don't really sort of go into writing anything with with a set idea in mind of what I have to do. It needs to be following various things. It's start out at the beginning, have an idea of the ending, and hope the two meet up.
Yeah, right. How about you, Daniel?
Yeah, I think I think the thing is that the first thing my mind goes to is probably murders, because there's the high stakes. Mm-hmm. And it just makes sense that a police officer's going to turn up soon after that's happened, which is why I think I keep coming back to the detective books, even though perhaps the procedural element's not a priority to me. But I think even in one of my books, like a whole third of the book is probably, if you broke it down and filtered it out, there's a third of the book is just dry information that gets you, that's the whole plot and all the clues and the plot twist and everything. And the trick is somehow, sprinkling that in, all that dry information, into something that's entertaining at the end. And I think that's the trick. And I mean, the chapters that I struggle the most with is when I'm being forced to write something, because I've got to a point where I know that something has to happen in the book at this point, and I'm absolutely forced to put it in. And they're always the chapters that take me about a whole week to get through. I do struggle with them, because I'd rather go off on a weird tangent, which I tend to do quite a lot. But there's definitely, just because it's not a procedural book doesn't mean it's not still clever, and there's a lot going on in there.
Oh no, for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, then. Well, something that I know is important to all of you, at least I hope it is. Otherwise, I might think about going home here. But it's the idea of the forensic science. I mean, how keenly do you keep up with the forensic science? And I think, Simon, you're the best one to start with here, I think.
I wouldn't say I keep up with it. It's like, I know people who do. So I'm a great believer in, when you don't know something, ask someone who does.
Right.
That's how I approach it. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, I went over to the body farm in Tennessee, which gave me the idea for it. And I kept in touch with the forensic scientists, the anthropologists I met over there, who helped me with the first one. And then, I got in touch with British forensic anthropologists and police officers. So you end up growing this sort of list of people who don't sort of hang the phone up or spam your emails when you ask them all these questions. And that's how I approach it. So I don't read, the forensic side of things from unless I'm writing a book. And I think, I'd much rather go to the fountainhead and talk to people who actually do this sort of thing for a living and really do know what they're talking about. And then I think the trick is to try and make it sound as if it's all coming from me in the first place.
Yeah. Daniel?
Yeah, I think there's people out there who are, experts in their field who are writing crime novels. So I'm not at all, and I try and stick to what I'm good at. So I don't try and be too clever with it in any particular part, because there's someone who's going to know a hell of a lot more than I do. But I think the forensic side of things, it's just an absolutely inevitable part of a crime novel. It's going to happen at some stage. They're going to look at the body and say, what's happened here?
Yes.
So it's definitely in all of my books, and I do my best to get away with it, basically.
And Matt?
Yeah, I mean, similar, really. I mean, I think, forensics has obviously been the big, since Colin Pitchfork and all that, that's been the big driver, I think, in crime, both real and fictional. So you can't ignore it. And actually, there are some, fascinating things. Well, one of the books I wrote was all about serial arsonists. And again, with that sort of stuff, clearly you need to, I did a lot of research for that one, because fires sort of, reveal their own story if you know what to look for. And so I think some of the books I've really had to go, and that's always fascinating, because I was always hopeless at science. So for me, it's been quite sort of illuminating to sort of go there. But I think in reality, I think that all procedure and all sort of forensics, triangulation, or any sort of stuff that any tool that police use is actually really ultimately only there to help you elucidate the who and the why, really, and the psychology of killing. And I think, for me, it's interesting, where does a novel start from? And for me, the why of why people do things that are harmful, immoral, lethal in most cases. Why does a serial killer repeatedly kill someone? That's the thing that's most interesting is the why they do it. What's the killer trying to achieve in Mimic or in one of Simon's books or whatever? And I think that's the most interesting thing. And all those police tools, and you have to use them, and you can use them inventively, but ultimately they are all servants to the why, because I think that's both morally and narratively the most interesting element of any crime book is why someone would do this. That's what it helps to illuminate.
So in truth, you don't really care about the not care, that's not the right way to put it. You don't really worry too much about the detail. It's not about that, because I mean, one of the questions people asked me was sort of like, have they got a go-to police officer? And I mean, there's a question about how realistically do you follow procedure? Well, of course, if you did, you'd have lots of documents and, they'd be sitting down at the telephone for hours and hours on end, and it wouldn't make for much fun read anyway. But I take it basically you're saying it's a creative form.
Well, I think, whenever I do research, I do loads of research and then I sort of throw it all away and then write what I want to write. But hopefully it's sort of marginally better informed than it was before. And I think, Helen Grace would both be dead and have been dismissed several times, from the force for all the shit she's done. I'm sure the same is true in the other guys' books as well, because actually, it's not a documentary. And I think, you watch some of those brilliant police documentaries where they're hunting paedophiles, whatever, and they're absolutely fascinating, but they're uniquely depressing and sort of quite hard work in some ways, because you see the sort of, the painstaking kind of efforts they go through and all the rest of it. And I think that, it's really interesting. When I was writing, and this is relevant, I promise you, but when I was writing Truth or Dare, there was that sort of slight fear I had when the sort of daily roll call of death on the news in sort of March, April, May last year was at its height. And you thought, God, is anyone going to want to read crime books? Because there's so much death everywhere. And maybe they'd prefer romances or perhaps Daniel could write a sci-fi novel or something, and it would just sort of be a bit of, but actually you realize that crime in its own dark way is just pure escapism as well. Mm. And I think certainly, the books that I write and Daniel write, and I don't know whether Simon would agree as well, but I would view my books as escapism, because Helen acts in a way that's more exciting than anybody else I know, or certainly any police officer I know. And that's what's fun about her, is that she does break the rules and and throw her body in the line of danger and all that sort of stuff. So I think, all the thing about all those procedural and things, it's all great, but ultimately, certainly as far as I'm concerned, I'm not doing a documentary. For me, it is pure escapism and should be treated as such.
How do you see the research, Simon?
It's a different thing for me because with the David Hunter series, he's a forensic scientist, so you've got to really, get the basics right. But having said that, it's still got to feed the story. It's still got to, you don't want. It's not a textbook that will bore me to tears anyway. So it's got to inform the story and add to the story, but not take over. So it's a part of it. But yeah, I think that the story and the characters have to shine through. Everything else is below that. But I do like to try and make it as realistic as I can. I mean, when I wrote The Chemistry of Death, I spoke to a British forensic anthropologist who helped me with it, and he, I gave him a copy, and I was quite nervous of what he'd say. And he said, "Yeah," he said, "you got the science spot on, but my life isn't as interesting." Which I thought was a great way of putting it. And so I try and get the facts as close as I can, but you are telling a story, and it needs to be entertaining. So yeah, I would say as well, I regard we're in the entertainment business.
Yeah, and Daniel, obviously you don't like actually spending time writing all that stuff anyway, do you? You want to get to the exciting bits.
Yeah, I'll just go off on a weird tangent so I can make some silly joke that's been in my head all day. But I mean, I think it's back to what I said earlier about those ground rules. You kind of set them out at the beginning of your novel, and I do research. It's kind of Wikipedia based in the main, but I do research things, but I just make it as passable as it needs to be to propel the story onwards, really. But yeah, I do some work. I promise.
You're right. It is a sort of trick, isn't it? In the sense that if the story is credible and people go with it, then you've done your job, haven't you? And actually, they don't need sort of an appendix explaining the sort of reality of how things decompose or whatever. If you can say it with enough confidence, and people buy it and go with it, don't question it, then you've done, and that's why sort of all these books are basically sort of tricks or manipulation in some way, because it's just about carrying the reader with you, isn't it?
Yeah. Just bear in mind, you're not actually writing for the one person who sits down on the day they get the book and goes looking through it for the mistake. And when they get there, they can start writing the letter off to the author.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, how important is location then? I mean, we're seeing a lot more regional cop stories, a lot more regional crime stories. Let's widen it out a little bit. But I mean, we boosted the murder rate all over the country. You have in Southampton for a start, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm just wondering, do you need to kind of own the place you're writing about? Matt?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I went with my kids to the Roald Dahl Museum, which is out in Buckinghamshire, and they had one section which was all different writers. It was like a sort of interactive story workshop where kids could make stories or stop movie animation, all that sort of stuff. And it was really interesting. But one section they had just authors talking about their craft, and they had J.K. Rowling and Michael Morpurgo and Philip Pullman. And I listened to the P.D. James one, and it was absolutely fascinating because she pretty much said that all of her stories started with a place, which I find that sort of blows my mind, really, because for me, Daniel may be different, but I think of Daniel's books as very sort of high concept, and mine is sort of relatively high concept. And for me, it is the concept of the killing that the sort of, that drives me first. Obviously, I'm sort of located in Southampton now, and that was partly just because I enjoyed port cities, and I think there's, they're just very complex and have their own. It was also partly because there was no fictional cop base there, so that was also quite important because a lot of British cities have already been taken, so you have to sort of choose quite carefully. But for me, it was, and I enjoyed that locale, and I continue to enjoy it. But it wasn't sort of site specific. These books could have been set elsewhere. They happen to be set there, and I've enjoyed Southampton fully and researched it lots and stuff. But the idea of starting a book from a sense of place sort of slightly blew my mind, because I thought, well, how do you create a narrative out of a place? But for P.D. James, absolutely, it was a deserted beach, or it was an abandoned house, or something. And it sounds like Simon has sort of a bit of that going on too. Just actually that place. From there comes this great story. So it is important to me. But the idea of just picking a location and just dreaming up a story slightly freaks me out, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's interesting because P.D. James are so character-driven in novels as well.
Yeah, no,
so
I
what
know.
What is it like for you, Simon?
If I find it hard to actually write a story unless I can see where I'm setting it. So I have to visualize something. So the place is really important for me. With The Lost, it's the opening scene in the abandoned warehouse. I needed to actually see that in my mind's eye. I don't go into too much description because I think that can kill it, but you need to give people a sense of it. So, but I need to actually be able to see it. So I've got the geography of it worked out in my own head. And so, yeah, it is very important for me, the setting of it. The first David Hunter novel, The Chemistry of Death, I set it in Norfolk Woods, because I wanted somewhere, having been to the Body Farm, which was in Tennessee during summer, I wanted somewhere that sort of captured that sort of feel. And there isn't that much in the UK, so Norfolk was about as close as I could get. But again, it was very important to set it in the right sort of place. And the David Hunter novels are all set in a completely different part of the country. Each novel is almost like a stranger in a strange land. He goes into a new place. And I enjoy writing about different places from a stranger's perspective as well. The new book, The Lost, is set in London. But again, as I was saying earlier, the actual locations within that are largely imaginary, based on places I might have seen. But it's a sort of an imaginary landscape because I want people to be able to visualize it without thinking, I recognize that street, is there a post box on that corner? Or
right, yes. Yeah, I see that. Daniel?
I think when I first had the concept for Ragdoll, like Matt said, it's such a ridiculous concept. It's so high concept. I felt that I couldn't really set it in Bournemouth. It felt too big. I felt like it was inherently like British, but I felt that I still had to set it on the biggest stage that I possibly could.
Right.
So that's why I landed on London. And I mean, Hangman, I took off to New York for sort of half the book in that. But I think the thing with both those places is that I've never lived in either of them. And I find them both quite exciting. And I think I write them from the view of sort of a tourist in these places. I hadn't spent an awful lot of time in London until I started getting invited up for book stuff. So I've managed to hold on to some of that, and I still find going to London quite exciting. But yeah, any time that I don't spend on researching police procedural stuff, I do spend on the locations. I like to go to them. I like to walk around them. You know, like Simon said, not go into it too much. Just to prove that you've been there, but you know, just to get a sense of it, and hopefully that comes across in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting though, the idea that serial killers are like too big for some locations. They have to have these big centers to match them as well. Matt, a particular question for you, because yours are the closest to the police procedural in one sense, in that you have an office, you have police staff, you know, they work together as a team, or in this case, not particularly much like a team at all. In fact, it's there's a rivalry going on there that's quite a thing. But what I was wondering was, when you write a series, is there an issue between the personal stuff, because you want the people to be interested in the characters, and the story, the actual plot that you want to carry them as well?
Not really. I mean, I think the one informs the other. I think, you know, all of the books that I write are designed to be read as standalones if you want to have a really good sort of serial killer thriller. But, you know, you can't ignore the fact that people get attached to characters, you know, and that and it was one of the things I've been most, and it's the most obvious thing in the world, but it still took me by surprise, that once you create a character, people invest in them. And because because a book is a dialogue between the writer and the reader, and you offer linguistic prompts, but they create the images in their head, right? So their Helen Grace looks different to mine, looks different to yours, whatever it may be. So it does become a very personal thing, reading a book, and people become very attached to them. And I remember once I did a book event in Thessalonica in the northern Greece mainland, and I turned up there, and I'm sure these guys will kind of sympathize with. And you turn up and you think, well, I've done Athens, that was quite a nice crowd, but then you head north and you think, well, it's Tuesday night in Thessalonica, and I have no idea whether anyone's going to turn up or not, whether this is going to be a sort of kind of long embarrassment. But actually it was a nice crowd, and they turned up, and afterwards, you know, people came up, and this woman grabbed my arm and she said to me, she said, Helen Grace must get married and she must have babies, she must be happy, you know, like, oh, and literally she had quite a forceful grip, this lady, and about sort of 10 minutes later I got my arm back. And the next lady came up and she said, Helen Grace must never get married. It would be a massive betrayal of her character. It's like, okay, fair. You know, so you realize that these people get, the readers get massively attached to the thing. So you have to service those characters, but inevitably, you know, their character development tends to chime with the main story in the book. You know, that's the sort of writer's job in a way, to make it all tally up thematically. And I think, I mean, occasionally I sort of throw googlies in there. So at the end of the 5th book, Little Boy Blue, Helen was basically framed and banged up for murder. So the whole of the 6th book was Helen Grace in the last days of Holloway prison, banged up in Holloway, and there was a serial killer on the inside of the prison who was sort of hunting people down behind bars, which was good fun. And, you know, that was really interesting because all the other books have been neatly resolved, but that one I left a massive cliffhanger. And most people loved it. Some people hated it because they thought, oh, you can't leave it like that. You know, I've got to wait another year. How could you, all that sort of stuff. But, you know, so I think occasionally you throw in curveballs, but you have to develop the character and have to keep it moving. But at the same time, you know, you have to give people sort of, one-off satisfaction. Otherwise, they get really peeved.
Yeah. Right. It's interesting what you said about people and the way they see the characters, because I certainly don't like to watch a film before I read a book or see the book cover, you know, where it's got the film on it. And Simon, how do you feel about adaptations?
It'd be nice if it happened. I think there's one or two ways you can go. I think it was Alan Coben who said that, you know, his approach to it was to basically you get the script, you put it into your arm, you get in the car, you drive out to the desert, you go to the fence, you throw the book over the fence, and then you drive away again, and leave them to it. I think I'd like to be a bit more hands-on, just to be sure if anything happens, it's not too far away from the book's intention. But you've got to accept it's a different medium. It will change, and I think if you try and hold on to it too much, it's probably not good. So I think at some point, I mean, Matt's going to know far more about this side of things than I am. I think you've got to just let go of it and think, okay, I wrote the book, but that's mine. But this is going to be something different, and try and be a bit more relaxed about it, which I think I am probably more now than I used to be. Just accept that it's not going to be necessarily your vision that you see on screen, but hopefully it's going to be something close enough that people will also enjoy.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Daniel, I suppose, of course, you would like to see your books made into films, but how do you feel about it?
So the big news is that the TV show is happening and filming at the moment, which is very exciting. It's the guys who made Killing Eve who are in charge of it. So I think it's in really good hands. Killing Eve was a perfect example of the dark humor and sort of the thriller sort of side of things, and sometimes a bit gruesome. And they pulled it off there, so I'm sure they can again with Ragdoll. I'm not hugely involved. I'd love to be, but they sort of doing their own thing with it. They've sent me the scripts. I think if you'd have asked me 5 years ago, I'd have given you a different answer. But I think, like Simon said, like you have to take a step back and accept it's a different medium. I mean, I've written 5 and a bit books since then, so I think I'm able to take that step back and accept that it's someone else's take on the story.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we look forward to that, by the way. I'm just wondering, I've avoided this most of the way along because you see a lot of these book talks when people start talking about COVID, and I don't want to go back over what it was like for you, but I'm just wondering, are you, and I know nobody's got a crystal ball, but are you concerned about COVID might have to feature in books in the future in some form? It could be an ongoing thing. I mean, it could affect how offices are set up and all sorts of things. Simon?
Yeah, it sort of plays on your mind, and I did wonder how to handle it because I was writing The Lost during lockdown, and it was one of those things you think, do you need to acknowledge this? And in the end, because I'd started the book and it was set in a period, predating that, I decided not to. What will happen in future, I'm not sure, and I think a lot depends on if we settle into a permanent state, where masks and everything become a part of everyday life. I think unless you're going to set something specifically within the pandemic era, if you like, and we don't know yet how long that's going to be, the danger is you can't predict what's going to be happening. So at some point it might have to, but then by the time the book comes out, events in the real world might have moved on and changed. So I think it's going to be a tricky one. I'm not quite sure, how I'll deal with that in the future. But it's something I think you either have to bear it in mind or just think, okay, it's a fictional universe. I'm not going to acknowledge it or whatever.
And how would you feel about that, Matt, with Helen Grace and the ongoing stories?
Well, I mean, I mentioned it very briefly in Truth or Dare, but generally I'm trying to ignore it because it's just so dreary. And I sort of think that, it's been fascinating sort of how people have responded in different ways to the privations of the last year. But escapism to me seems to have become more and more important, just as some antidote to one's tedious life. And so I sort of hope that by the time the next one comes out, which will be this time next year, that we might be in a space that's sort of mercifully free from too many restrictions. So I sort of am going to try and ignore it if that's possible, and hope for the best. But there will be subtle, I think, as you say, people will have changed their probably work-life balance and then the way they work. So I think inevitably it will seep in. But as long as Helen is not sort of constantly clutching hand sanitizer and wearing a mask, I think that's essentially what I'm trying to avoid if possible, because it doesn't help when you're riding a motorbike. That's the thing.
How about you, Daniel? Do you think it'll affect your writing?
Yeah, I mean, just as Matt said, really, if you're going for escapism, it's pretty much the last thing you want to be thinking about. So I'm going to avoid it as far as I possibly can. There's obviously going to be, the knock-on effects, the lasting changes to society that, you're going to have to acknowledge to keep it vaguely realistic. But I'll avoid it as much as possible. As far as I'm certain, the only good thing that came out of the whole pandemic was, those first lockdowns, I got so much written. I'm pretty easily distracted. So when you're actually locked in your house and told to get on with some work, it kind of worked for me. So I got some work done at least. But apart from that, ignore it as much as possible.
Yeah, you need the discipline. Matt, who would play Helen Grace?
Oh, well, that's a tricky one, isn't it? It's if I revealed that, then I would have to reveal how I see her. But I mean, I think that
point.
Well, it's touching back. I mean, because I've never really specified Helen's look. I mean, she's quite athletic and all the rest of it, but I've never specified hair color or anything like that. And I always love doing the reader events when you say, what does she look like? And they, and like half the audience say she's blonde or she's got brown hair, or and they look at each other as if they're mad, because as if it's totally obvious from the text, that she is blonde. And I love that, because you think they've obviously created this image in their head that's so sort of kind of carved in granite now that they just can't get out of it. So, I mean, I don't know, at the end of the day, you want someone who's brilliant and who is also available, which is always a key issue. And more, he'll do it for the money. So that's but I mean, I don't know. There are a million ones. I love actors like Ruth Wilson, people like that who just are unusual, who are sort of slightly kind of left or right of centre. She did a brilliant. I mean, she was a psychopath in Luther, but she did that really well. But I like those characters who just look a bit different, who surprise you, and I think you could imagine would have quite a sort of rich hinterland. But if she looked completely different, that would be cool too, because I think whatever you do, you're going to piss off about 75% of the readers who viewed her as looking completely different.
It's interesting you mentioned Ruth Wilson there, because I think one of the things about the way she plays the part, and it's interesting, is the when you play the psychopath, do you ham it?
Yeah.
Personally, the way I see the performance in The Silence of the Lambs from Anthony Hopkins, or you play it like Brian Cox did, which is just controlled. And he just oozes complete danger. I mean, what do you think about that, Simon?
What about Silence of the Lambs?
Well, about the idea of playing the psychopath, the hamming it up or playing it straight. What do you think works best? And
I think it can go either way. I mean, both those interpretations of Hannibal Lecter, I think, are fantastic. I think Anthony Hopkins was probably the more better known one. But you're right. Brian Cox was terrific in it, and he's just so menacing in a way that Anthony Hopkins isn't. I mean, Anthony Hopkins just dominates every scene he's in. You can't take your eyes off it. Brian Cox plays it completely differently. But I think there's no right or wrong way. It depends on the source material. It depends on the tone as well. The tone of the book or the adaptation. So I don't think there's any one hard or fast rule that you can say it's, and as we've been saying earlier, everybody's got their own idea. Any character, if they're not described, and even if they are sometimes, readers will form their own picture. It's like listening to somebody on the radio. When you actually, see the person to put a face and a voice, it's generally completely different. So I think it's the same with portrayals of any characters really. There's different ways of coming at it, and as long as it's not awful, then it's fair game.
Yeah. Okay. Just to finish off, then, can I ask everybody for a recommendation? It can be a book, it can be a film. Daniel, let's start with you.
A crime one.
Well, no. If you want to. No, you carry on, please.
Well, if we're going with anything, I watched a movie the other night called Whiplash, which was very famous and won lots of awards. But I only got round to seeing it the other day, and it was amazing, about jazz drumming. So I'd highly recommend that to anyone if you wanted to break from crime reading for a night.
Matt.
Although Whiplash has a kind of baddie in it, who is sort of so intensely impressive that it, you know, could be, well, probably is a sociopath, but yeah, awesome film, amazing. What would I recommend? I'm afraid I always go old because I'm basically quite old myself, and my touchstone is always Patricia Highsmith, who I love, and I would recommend Deep Water novel, which I think they've made into a TV or a movie or something coming out soon anyway. Which, you know, the thing I love about Highsmith is that basically there are no nice characters in any of her books. You know, everybody, even the minor characters, are all fallen and sinful and awful. So it's like, for me, it's true noir. And I love that book because it's about a guy who's married. It's like 1950s America, with a young daughter. His wife is awful and is constantly having affairs and humiliating him, but he sort of stays in the marriage because of the daughter and social convention. And then one day he's at a pool party and he ends up in the swimming pool with his wife's latest lover, who's not a great swimmer. And without really thinking, he just drowns him. You know, there's no premeditation. He just kills him. And then obviously people think, oh, it's been a terrible accident. And you spend the whole rest of the novel hoping this guy will get away with it because you totally understand why he did it. You might do the same in his position. And his wife's dreadful and he didn't much like the lover. And it's just her ability to make you constantly want murderers to get away with it and just sort of get away scot-free just boggles me. And I wish I could write as well as, and I never will be able to, but I hold her in the greatest awe. And I think any of her books are wonderful, but I'm going to go for Deep Water.
Right. And Simon, you want to round us off?
Yeah, again, something probably a little different, and I'll go old as well. John Wyndham, who I read as a kid, and I'm rereading at the moment the Kraken Wakes, which is fantastic. I mean, everybody, you know, the famous one is the Daily Triffids. You know, to my mind, I think the Kraken Wakes is actually, I prefer it.
Right.
It's just a wonderful story, and it's also remarkably relevant to, when you're reading it now, to what's going on. Is the fact people won't believe official stories, that what's going on in the news isn't necessarily to be believed, is it a cover-up? And I think it's been described as a master of the, I think, cozy catastrophe or something. But yeah, so I think a lot of John Wyndham's stories are terrific, and they still hold up now.
I'm very pleased you chose that, Simon, because when we had our first child, whenever she started screaming at sort of 2 a.m. in the morning, we always used to say to each other, the Kraken Wakes, and that was our code for yet another night of hell that was sort of about to sort of land upon us. So that's an excellent choice.
Yes.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That's been a fascinating chat, and thank you to everyone for watching.